Hello, control room. Anyone hear the words echoed in the dark room? John Carter stood with his hand on the broken console, his voice rough from days without rest. Screens were cracked, lights flickered, and wires sparked above him. He looked around the empty place, but no one answered. John tried again, louder this time. Hello, control room. Anyone here? Silence filled the chamber. Only the hum of failing power systems answered him. His chest grew heavy, but he forced himself to stand tall. He could not let the others see him weak. Outside the window, he saw ships drifting, most of them damaged. They carried survivors from many lost worlds, men and women who had nowhere else to go. His closest friend David Clark entered the room. His face was tired, but his eyes held a spark of will. No answer, John, he asked. None, John said. I keep calling, but no one replies. David stepped closer and touched the side of the console. The old machine came alive with a sudden burst, and a faint voice filled the room. It was a message, broken and filled with static, but clear enough to understand. To all who are lost, this is Queen Helen of Earth. If you hear this, you are not alone. Come to us. The voice cut, then returned with the same words again. John froze. He turned to David, his mouth dry. Did you hear that? Yes, David said. Queen Helen of Earth. John looked through the cracked window once more. Earth was spoken of in whispers. A world full of storms and danger. A place no one dared to live near. It was called wild and merciless. A death world where only the strongest could stand. Yet here was a queen offering them shelter. David leaned close. It could be a trick. John shook his head. No, listen to her voice. She is not lying. They played the message again, and more survivors gathered in the control room. Alex Harris, a young fighter with scars across his face, stood near the doorway. He crossed his arms and said, If it is true, then Earth is our only chance. Others muttered in fear. Some said they would not dare go near Earth. Some said they would rather drift and die in the dark. John raised his hand to silence them. We've been turned away from every gate. Every world closes its doors. We are hunted like animals. But here's a voice that calls us family. Queen Helen says, Come to us. I say we go. His words struck the room with power. The people were quiet. Many looked at one another, unsure. Then David placed his hand on John's shoulder. I follow you, Alex spoke next. Then I follow too. Lowly, one by one, the survivors nodded. John stood tall before them. Then it is decided. We set our course for Earth. He turned back to the console and sent a reply, his voice steady and strong this time. This is John Carter. We heard your call. We are coming. The signal was weak, but it carried hope. As it left the station, John felt something stir inside his chest. Not fear, not doubt, but fire. For the first time since the long flight began, he believed they might find a place to live. For the first time, he believed they might not be alone. The fleet of broken ships moved slowly through the dark. Engines sparked, metal groaned, and many of the vessels looked ready to fall apart. John Carter stood on the bridge of his small ship, watching the stars stretch before him. Behind him, hundreds of men and women waited for his command. They had chosen Earth. Now they had to survive the journey. David Clark entered and handed him a report. Fuel is low, John. If we fight before reaching Earth, we may not make it. John did not look away from the window. Then we must avoid a fight. But it was already too late. Alarms rang as ships appeared at the edge of the scanner. Fast and armed, they came with weapons ready. The survivors had been hunted before, and now the hunters had found them again. Alex Harris ran to his post and called out, They are locking on us. John's chest tightened. Prepare the shields. Get the families to the lower decks. The first strike hit like thunder, shaking the walls and throwing people to the ground. Sparks flew from the panels, and the lights dimmed. Men and women screamed as the ship rocked. David grabbed the controls. John, if we stand here, we die. Then we fight, John said. Ready the guns. The survivors had little training, but they had no choice. Ships turned, firing back with weak but desperate shots. Alex shouted as one enemy fighter blew apart in fire. They can bleed, he said. But more came, circling them, cutting off escape. John's ship shook again as another blast hit the side. Smoke filled the bridge. Through the fire and sparks, a new sound filled the comms. It was a voice, calm but firm. This is the fleet of Earth. You're under our shield now. John froze. The scanners lit up with signals. Huge ships appeared from the dark, rising like giants around them. They were fast, heavy, and armed with weapons brighter than suns. The hunters turned their fire on the newcomers, but the human ships moved with skill. Lines of fire cut through the enemy ranks. One after another, the hunters exploded, breaking apart under the strikes of Earth's fleet. David's eyes widened. We are saved. The screen came alive, and Queen Helen herself appeared. She wore a crown of steel, and her gaze was strong and steady. Her voice cut through the chaos. To all who flee, you are safe under me. Earth does not turn away the broken. Earth fights for them. The survivors stared in silence. Many dropped to their knees. Some wept. John stepped forward and spoke. Queen Helen, we heard your call. We are yours. She nodded once, then fight beside us and live as one of us. The enemy fleet began to scatter, but the Earth ships hunted them down without mercy. Soon the dark was clear again, and the survivors floated in the shadow of giants. Alex slammed his fist on the console and shouted in triumph, "We are not prey anymore." Survivors cheered, the sound echoing through every deck. John looked once more at the screen where Queen Helen stood. For the first time, he saw a leader who did not look at them with disgust or fear. She looked at them as people. David whispered, "John, we may have found home." John nodded. "Prepare the course. Take us to Earth." The survivors set their engines toward the blue planet ahead. It glowed like fire in the distance, strong and alive. For the first time in their long flight, hope was not just a word. It was a path, guarded by the strongest fleet they had ever seen. The ships entered Earth's orbit, and the survivors stared in silence at the world below. The blue ocean shined, the green land stretched wide, and storms rolled across the skies like living giants. Many whispered to one another. They had been told Earth was wild, untamed, and merciless, but now it looked alive, full of strength. John Carter stood at the front of the bridge, his eyes locked on the sight. Queen Helen's voice came through the comms. "Welcome to Earth. You are safe now, but safety must be guarded with steel. If you wish to live here, you will fight beside us." The ships landed on wide plains where camps had been built. Lines of tents and strong walls rose around them, guarded by men and women in armor. The survivors were taken in, given food and water, and told to rest. But the rest did not last long. Training began the next morning. John, David Clark, and Alex Harris stood with a group of survivors in a wide yard. Earth soldiers waited for them, armed with rifles and blades. One of the trainers, a tall man named Samuel Price, stepped forward. His voice was sharp. "Here there is no weak. If you want to stay, you fight. You bleed with us, and you rise with us." The first drills began. Survivors who had never held a weapon were given rifles. Samuel shouted orders, and soldiers showed them how to fire, how to reload, and how to move as one. Mistakes were punished with more drills. There was no kindness, only demand for strength. At first, the survivors stumbled. Some dropped their weapons. Some cried out in pain. But John stood tall and refused to quit. His will spread through the others. David pushed himself until his hands bled. Alex shouted at those who wanted to fall back, dragging them forward into line. Days turned into weeks. Slowly, the survivors changed. Hands grew steady, eyes grew sharp, and fear was burned away in fire and sweat. They learned to fight in teams, to trust one another, and to follow orders with speed. Queen Helen herself walked among them one morning. She wore armor instead of a crown, her blade at her side. Her eyes looked at each face, judging not by where they came from, but by how they stood. When she saw John, she stopped.
You were the one who called to me," she said.
"Yes," Queen John replied. "I called and you answered." She nodded. "You will lead them in the field." The words struck him heavy, but he did not bow. He looked her in the eye and said, "Then I will not fail." At night the campfires burned, and men and women who once feared Earth now sang with Earth's soldiers. They shared stories, laughter, and scars. John saw the change. They were no longer broken. They were becoming part of something greater. But news of war reached the camp. Scouts returned with word of enemy fleets gathering beyond the edge of the system. They were coming to wipe out Earth and all who stood with it. Samuel called the new fighters to the yard and spoke. "The time is close. You have trained. You have bled. Now you will show that you are no longer outcasts. You are soldiers of Earth." John raised his rifle and shouted, "We will not run again." The camp roared with voices. Men and women who had once been cast aside now stood ready to fight for the first home that did not refuse them. David looked at John and said, "This is what we were meant for." John stared at the night sky, where stars burned bright. Soon the fight would come, and they would face it not as prey, but as warriors of Earth. The fleet moved into the cold space near Jupiter. The giant planet glowed with storms that twisted like fire, and the moons around it shined pale in the dark. Earth's fleet stood ready, rows of warships armed and waiting. Beside them, the ships of the survivors held position. They were patched, rough, and old, but their crews stood tall at their posts. John Carter walked across the deck of his ship. His hands were steady, though his heart pounded in his chest. David Clark checked the weapons system, while Alex Harris strapped on armor, ready for the fight to come. The comms came alive with the voice of Queen Helen. "The enemy is near. Today you stand with us, not as strangers, not as broken, but as defenders of this world. Hold the line and let no one pass." Her words carried through every ship. Cheers rose from soldiers and survivors alike. Sensors lit up with red marks. The enemy fleet arrived, vast and armed with fire. They moved in tight formation, ready to strike. The sky between the two forces grew heavy with silence before the storm. Fire. The word carried across the fleet, and the battle began. Lines of energy streaked across the black, tearing into ships. Explosions lit the dark and broken metal spun away. John's ship shook as blasts struck the shields. "Return fire!" David shouted. Their guns roared back, and one enemy fighter tore apart in a burst of flame. Alex cheered, but the fight was far from over. Enemy ships swarmed like wolves circling the survivor fleet. John gave quick orders, turning his ship to cover the weaker vessels. "Protect the transports. Do not let them fall." The sky burned with light as Earth's fleet clashed with the enemy. Ships rammed, weapons struck, and wreckage floated between the lines. John's ship rocked again as another blast hit the side. Smoke filled the bridge, but he refused to fall back. Then came the call. "Boarding parties incoming." A shuttle slammed into John's ship, and metal claws tore through the hull. Soldiers poured in with blades and guns. The decks shook with the sound of battle. John drew his rifle and led his crew into the corridor. David was beside him, firing with steady aim. Alex charged with a blade, striking down foes in close fight. Screams filled the halls, but the survivors held the line. "Push them back," John shouted. "This ship is ours." The fight turned brutal, men and women locked in hand-to-hand combat. Steel met steel, and blood stained the walls. John's arm burned with pain as he blocked a strike, then drove his blade through his foe. David pulled two men back from the edge, keeping them alive. Alex fought like a storm, his shouts driving fear into the enemy. Step by step, they forced the boarders back. The last enemy fell, and silence filled the corridor. But the battle outside raged on. The enemy flagship loomed, its guns tearing into Earth's lines. Queen Helen's voice came through the comms again. "We must break their leader, or they will not fall." John wiped blood from his face and looked at David and Alex. "We take their flagship." "You are mad," Alex said, but his grin showed he was ready. David nodded. "Then let us be mad together." They boarded a shuttle with a squad of survivors and sped through fire toward the massive ship. Enemy guns blazed, but Earth's fleet cleared a path. The shuttle slammed into the side of the flagship, cutting through its hull. Doors blew open, and John led the charge inside. The hull shook with alarms as the fight began again. Blades clashed, guns roared, and every step forward was won with blood. John's voice rang over the sound of battle. For Earth. For Queen Helen. For home. His men answered with a roar, and they drove deeper into the heart of the enemy's ship. The hulls of the enemy flagship shook with fire and smoke. John Carter pushed forward with his rifle in hand, leading the survivors and soldiers through waves of defenders. David Clark stayed close, covering the left side, his shots sharp and steady. Alex Harris moved like a storm, striking with blade and gun, his face set in fire. Every step deeper into the ship was harder than the last. The enemy fought with rage, but the survivors no longer broke. They fought back with strength they had never known before. Men and women who had once been turned away now roared with fury, proving they belonged. A heavy blast rocked the corridor. Now John staggered but kept his feet. He pointed ahead. The control room is near. Once we take it, the ship is ours. They forced open a steel door and charged inside. Alarms wailed and lights flashed red. The enemy commander stood at the far end giving orders. His guards rushed forward, blades raised. The clash was brutal. Steel struck steel, guns fired at close range, and bodies fell on both sides. John's rifle ran dry, and he swung it like a club, knocking one man to the ground. David covered him, dropping another with a clean shot. Alex roared as he drove his blade through two men at once. The last guard fell and the room grew quiet, but for the sound of fire and smoke. John staggered to the main console and slammed his hand on the controls. David began working the system, his hands quick and sure. Alarms filled the bridge as the flagship's guns turned away from Earth's fleet. Outside the window, the massive ship shifted, its weapons now silent. John gave the order, set it on a crash course. David nodded, done. The flagship lurched, engines burning at full power, heading straight into the heart of its own fleet. The enemy tried to stop it, but it was too late. The giant vessel smashed into its brothers, and the blast tore through the dark. Fire spread, and ships fell one after another. On every channel, cheers erupted. Earth's fleet roared with victory. The survivor ships shouted with joy. Queen Helen's voice cut through the noise. The line is broken. Drive them out. Earth's fleet surged forward, striking what remained of the enemy. Within moments, the sky was clear. Wreckage floated silent among the stars. Inside the flagship, John looked at David and Alex. "It is done." Alex laughed, his voice rough but full of life. "We brought down giants." David smiled through the smoke. "And we stood as one." They made their way back to their shuttle, battered but alive. When they returned to their ship, the survivors greeted them with cries of triumph. John stood before them, his face dark with blood and ash, but his eyes burned bright. The comms lit again, and Queen Helen appeared. Her voice carried across every ship. "Today you proved who you are. You are not refuse. You are not broken. You are our family. Under Earth's banner, you stand as one with us." Men and women across the fleets fell silent, then lifted their voices together in a roar that shook the air. They were no longer wanderers, no longer rejected. They were part of something greater. On the ground of Earth, when the ships landed, Queen Helen herself met them. She wore her armor still, but her smile was fierce and proud. She placed her hand on John's shoulder. "Come. You called to us, and we answered. Now you are home." John looked across the fields of Earth, the skies alive with storms and light. He thought of the long days when no one had answered his call, when silence was their only reply. Now that silence was broken forever. For the first time in their lives, the survivors had a place that did not turn them away. For the first time, they were not outcasts. They were Earth's defenders, and they would never be refused again.